Good evening and welcome to the kickoff for the MyCP webinar series for 2021. Tonight, we're really excited to be able to share the results of some of our research for Research CP Dystonia Edition. And I've got some pictures here from those people who will be presenting. So the agenda is I'm going to take you quickly through what the Cerebral Palsy Research Network is and a little bit about MyCP. And then I am going to dive into Research CP Dystonia Edition, the process and the results. And then the clinicians that are on the call are going to talk about the uncertainties that were raised and how we've organized them. And then we'll leave it open for discussion. So for those of you who've dialed into this, some of our work before, you're going to see a new logo and a new mission. Our mission is to optimize the lifelong health and wellness of people with cerebral palsy and their families through high quality research, education, and community programming. And you might ask, why is it that you have a new logo and a new mission? Well, if you were on social media in the last week or two, you noticed that we announced that we did a merger with CP Now. So Michelle Schusterman founded CP Now and has been running that for the last 6 years. And Michelle and I have been working together very closely. She's been a significant leader in CPRN. And so we're merging our efforts under the brand of the Cerebral Palsy Research Network and bringing all of our websites and properties and programming together. So what is the CP Research Network? It is a 501c3 now since our merge with CP Now, and it is a collaborative network of institutions, of clinicians that treat people with CP, therapists, researchers, patient advocates, and caregivers that are all conducting research to improve outcomes for people with CP. It's also a data coordinating center at the University of Utah in the Department of Population Health Sciences. And we have some core infrastructure for accelerating research, a clinical and a community registry. Registries are databases of people with CP and characteristics about them. And then we now have education and well-being programs that we have picked up through our partnership and our merge with CP Now. MyCP is basically a web portal. It's a web address that you can go to join, and it is owned and operated by the CP Research Network and will be soon combined into CPRN.org. The portal offers the opportunity to participate in our community registry through participation in surveys. And it also has a forum for discussions about research and about the evidence base for various treatments. So that's a closed forum that has a number of the clinicians that are involved in CPRN and a broad array of the community. It's got about 1,100 members at this stage. And then it's also got tools for enhancing care for people with CP. And you can sign up at mycp.org. So the network is spread across North America, predominantly in the United States, but we also have one Canadian site, and we're talking to a couple other sites. The green pins are sites that are actively collecting data into the registry, though I note that Detroit we have 2 Detroit sites and one is yellow, and it's actually turned green. University of Michigan started enrolling patients in the registry just in the last 2 weeks. And so then you see the yellow ones are ones that are preparing the registry. Red are working through sort of the agreements with the University of Utah for compliance. And then blue are candidate sites that will be coming on board hopefully in the next 6 to 12 months to participate in our research and in our registry. So I'm going to go back to some slides we did when we kicked off the Research CP Dystonia Edition webinar series, the whole initiative back in October of 2019. So who are we in terms of the organizers of this? We are a number of clinicians that treat people with cerebral palsy. And a number of community members. So there were, I think, 6 or 7 of us in the planning of this sort of partnership from the beginning. Some of us are sort of nearly full-time on advocating for people with CP. And a number of the clinicians are really leaders in advancing research for and treatment for cerebral palsy and dystonia in CP. And why are we here? Well, it's because when we think about what we want to do from a research perspective, we really want to work on things that are priorities for people with CP and their caregivers. We want to work on things that matter most to the community. And so by involving the community and building relationships, we can help figure out what those priorities are. So that's critical to the concept of research CP. We laid out a process that said we would first educate people with a series of 3 webinars and give a common language. We would then do a survey to generate ideas and then to prioritize them through voting. And then we would have any discussions or clarifications through MyCP, and ultimately arrive in at a paper for publication where we would share that agenda and use that to start to drive research studies. We accomplished most of this in the first couple of months, and then the second set of arrows have stretched out to be about over a year for a variety of reasons. COVID and other reasons, we stretched out voting and the creation of the agenda to get maximal community participation. So we did an iterative process where we looked at the ideas that were generated, we refined them, we reached out to people to make sure that we were restating their ideas correctly or we understood them correctly, and then put it through the voting process. Oh, sorry, that didn't work. So the goal, again, that we originally laid out was after the submission of uncertainties or things that were not known about dystonia in CP. Those could be research questions, they could just be places where there were not enough evidence. The idea was that the study team would review and consolidate. Part of the review would be looking at the evidence that's available in the field to determine, were these really uncertain, or was it just the person writing them was uncertain about them, but they're actually known and we can provide the answer. And then to sort of consolidate these into themes to be able to look at them and understand which ones could be collapsed, and to organize them, and then put them into CoDigital, which was a tool we used for collaborative voting and prioritization. So we've done all that, and now the plan was to bring back the top 10, but we've actually made a little twist on the top 10, and we're bringing back the top 29, but grouped into 10 themes because they are similar. And so we're going to share those with you in a few moments. So the whole idea for us was to not be rigid about our process and make sure that we could adjust it as we went along. So we followed a methodology called the James Lind Alliance methodology for priority setting partnerships. It's an organization out of the UK that's done this for a lot of different disease and condition groups. And then we modified the process a bit to use CoDigital as a way of doing ranking, as opposed to just doing a sort of paper human intervention ranking. So it the software platform allows us to do ranking very easily, and it kind of speeds the process along. And then I'm skipping around, sorry, my mouse is not doing what I would like. And then we also, their methodology calls for an in-person workshop, which we did when we did the first research CP, and we decided for a variety of reasons that we would not do that. We would use a webinar format as a way to get feedback. So we took 166 participants through the webinar series to educate in this initial 3 set of webinars. And then after you participated in the webinars, you were allowed to generate uncertainties. Of those 166, 28 chose to participate, things that they thought were uncertain. And then the study group went through the ideas and vetted them to see whether or not there was uncertainty or whether or not there was actually evidence that said these things were well known. The process generated 113 ideas, of which after vetting for certainty and doing consolidation, we ended up with 67 unique ideas. And we loaded those into CoDigital and started voting. And 82 people participated in the voting on the CoDigital platform. And that produced a stack rank of ideas. And then we are using those ideas to organize them into themes that we're bringing back to you tonight. And those were organized by the 3 of the clinicians, 2 pediatric neurologists and 1 developmental pediatrician, that organized these, and we'll be presenting them to you shortly. So just a couple things about who participated. This is a table, and I don't expect you to read all these numbers. I've circled the ones that I think are interesting. For the generation of research ideas or things that were uncertain, 61% of the of the ideas were generated by people from the community, whereas 39% were generated by clinicians and researchers. And then in the voting process, it sort of shifted more the other direction. 43% of the people that participated in that were members of the community, and 56 were from the clinical community. And part of this is, as we promoted this out on social media and various platforms, more clinicians, more neurologists in particular, participated in the voting process. So if you look at the clinical disciplines that participated, you can see that 22% of those neurologists were generating uncertainties, whereas some physical medicine clinicians were generating ideas as well, and physical therapists. And then in terms of participating in voting, you can see that it was more heavily stilted towards neurology and physical therapy for participating in the final voting and ranking. So before I turn it over to the clinicians, I want to point out that just taking the top 10 ideas, and as I said, we really looked at the top 29, but just looking at the top 10 ideas and seeing what they ranked overall and what their score was, which means they got an upvote, 69% of the time for this first one. This is who was the source of the idea. And so you can see in the top 10, it is dominated by people with CP, parents and caregivers, and people that have CP themselves. So you can see that. And then there were other ideas by different clinical disciplines and researchers. But the community's ideas were very highly ranked in the resulting research agenda or uncertainty agenda. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Michael Kruer to talk about theme 1. And Michael, I'm assuming you can unmute yourself. You have done that, so take it away.
Thank you, Paul. So, our first theme that really came from this process was the theme that new treatments for dystonia in CP need to be developed. And in retrospect, this might not be so surprising, but this is something that resoundingly received votes. This was developed or came from 2 main consolidated ideas, one of which was ranked number 1, as Paul mentioned, and that was, can we find more effective medications for dystonia with fewer side effects and longer therapeutic effects than we currently have available? The other that was also included in this category was, can stem cell therapies improve outcomes for dystonia in CP? And so both of those were coalesced into this idea of developing new treatments for dystonia in CP. Next slide. And so I think when considering this particular theme and thinking about what we know now, all of us, whether you're a clinician, a researcher, a person with CP, a community member, we all want new and better treatments. But I think it's important to think about what sort of bottlenecks there are in the process. What makes this easy to say and difficult to do? And part of it likens back to the example of the kid taking apart a clock. And if you think about it, if we don't know how something is supposed to work, it's hard to fix it. And so some of the aspects of dystonia that might contribute to this particular bottleneck include the fact that we have an incomplete understanding of what causes dystonia in CP. And that's actually reflected in a later theme. Another factor is that there are several possible approaches, and this range from therapeutic interventions to medical interventions, surgical interventions. There are many good ideas out there, but none are guaranteed. And finally, something that I think many, if not all of us, recognize is that there's a general lack of support for research, or at least there's the opportunity to continue to raise funds for research and galvanize this work even further.
So that brings us to theme 2. My name is Bumara Abumadin. I'm one of the pediatric neurologists that Paul mentioned that was helping consolidate all of the great ideas that you guys gave us. Theme 2 is really extends in part from the weaknesses that were highlighted by theme 1. So we need new treatments because the ones that we have, we know don't work as well as we want to for a variety of reasons, side effects and efficacy. So theme 2 came from this idea, which was very highly ranked. What are the non-medical interventions that can help reduce dystonia? And we interpreted that to mean what are the non-medical, non-surgical rehabilitation and psychological management strategies that we can pursue to manage dystonia and CP. Next slide. So I want to highlight, I'm sorry, this figure is cutting out a little bit, but I want to highlight this really important paper published by Yona Novak's group that is a really great summary of what we know about a lot of the rehabilitation and psychological management strategies that are currently, or that have currently been studied in cerebral palsy. And the reference for that paper is here. I would encourage everybody, if you haven't already, to take a look at this paper. It's really beautifully done and a really comprehensive summary of what's out there. And in it, we see that Iona and colleagues have focused on some rehabilitation psychological management strategies and what's known about them really in the context of overall motor function, gross motor ability and hand function. And I have not, this is not a comprehensive circling of the therapies that she highlighted in this paper, but you can see that acupuncture is there in the yellow. These yellow circles represent interventions that, based on the literature, based on the evidence, are to probably do it to help improve motor function. These circles in the green are kind of in the definitely do it range to help improve motor function. And you see acupuncture in yellow, biofeedback in yellow, environmental enrichment in green, strength training in green, treadmill training in green. So a lot of these non-medical, non-surgical treatments have been studied in CP, but what we really need to find out is, what do they mean for dystonia? And the evidence there is really lacking, even though the infrastructure to study these things is already out there. So a lot of promise and perhaps low-hanging fruit here to assess a theme that was ranked really highly by the community and clinician voters.
I've got the next theme. So good afternoon and evening, everyone. And first of all, I want to do a shout out to Paul and Michelle Schusterman, Paul Gross and Michelle Schusterman. So congratulations on combining efforts. And I think it makes lots of sense. And I also really like the new logo. So looks powerful to me. So theme 3 is also very powerful. And you can see how many bullets of ideas were combined into theme 3. It ranked 3rd overall, but this was really trying to do a deep dive into looking at the effectiveness of medications, so pharmacologic treatments, and surgical treatments. So some of the surgical treatments that we currently have are deep brain stimulation and intrathecal backfin. And there were many ideas, I won't list them all here now, that went into this theme. Next slide, Paul. And so it was really easy to summarize what we know. And really, we're at a very early stage in understanding the evidence around pharmacologic and surgical treatments. So we have minimal information. And an example of this is we've created a care pathway in the American Academy for pharmacologic and surgical treatment management of dystonia and CP, and it's largely based on clinical expert opinion. So what do we need to find out? Clearly, we need to generate some more research studies looking at interventions. And If you can go to the next slide, Paul, thanks. I think one of the first bullet I've said here is I think we really need to utilize different study designs. So there is this study design called comparison effectiveness. And what CPRN is trying to do with these large registries will power comparison effectiveness studies in the real world. There's also a role for randomized controlled trials, and I think there's a role for N of 1 trials that are methodologically sound. I think as researchers, clinical researchers, we really need to advocate to use standardized outcomes. And these are the outcomes that individuals with dystonia and CP and families have told me that are important. So they want to look at dystonia, they want to look at function, they want to look at the impact on individualized goals. They want to look at pain, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And they want to understand what the potential side effects are of the treatments. And then they're not only interested in short-term impact, but they're also interested in long-term impact. On to theme 4 now.
So theme 4, several ideas coalescing into this theme 2. And this theme, we agree is incredibly important because how do you treat dystonia without being able to diagnose it consistently? So this theme is to improve the clinical consistency of diagnosis and severity assessments. You can see the ideas that coalesced into this theme, in part about raising awareness for clinicians and also for families about dystonia diagnosis. And then also this first idea I want to highlight explicitly: can a dystonia severity scale be made to be reliable for dystonia and CP? And I think this is key and feasible to implement in the clinic. So Paul, if you could go to the next slide. I think that feasibility may be something that's holding us back in terms of implementing standardized scales that are available. So the hypertonia assessment tool that was developed by Darcy and colleagues is an excellent tool for diagnosis, but doesn't quite get at the severity of dystonia as a grading mechanism. And the scales listed here have been specifically validated in children with dystonia and cerebral palsy. But the time required to implement them, best case scenario in the papers starts at 30 minutes. And when you have a clinician who has a 30-minute appointment slot to see a patient and answer all of their important concerns, it's hard to implement a scale that takes 30 minutes to do. So based on this, what we need to find out is what are the barriers to uptake of the scales and the tools that are available. And something that was mentioned in one of the uncertainties by someone who entered it was time. So what would make it feasible to do in the clinic? Another that has been highlighted in the literature is how reliable are the scales between practitioners? Is one person in one center going to use the scale differently from another person in another center? I think a big barrier to use of some of these scales, and in some cases the hat across specialties, is awareness of the tool itself, and how useful are these tools to assess what's most important to patients. So for example, the Berry-Albright dystonia scale does focus to some degree on function, but is rating the severity of dystonia really getting at what is important for function for the person with dystonia and CP? So I think that sort of focus is important as well. And lastly are these scales good enough, or are there better scales that we need to develop that are faster to implement and get at the questions we want to answer?
So on to theme 5, and it does overlap with what Boomer was just talking about. So first of all, I thought this was so smart of people to vote. I actually think this is super important, and it's an area that we've made progress in the last decade, making people aware that many individuals with cerebral palsy have mixed tone patterns, that they don't just have spasticity, but they also have dystonia. And so this idea percolated with people and it got ranked as theme 5. Next slide, Paul. So when we look at what we know, I think we're building capacity in terms of identifying individuals with mixed tone patterns. There's still work to do, but many people are becoming aware of the tool called the Hypertonia Assessment Tool, and it's a tool that can be built into clinical practice, and we're starting to get increased recognition of dystonia being present in individuals. But what do we need to find out? And Boom has already talked about this in the first bullet. I think we really do need to have easier ways of quantifying both the relative proportion of tone, how much is spasticity, how much is dystonia, but ways to easily quantify dystonia. And it's not necessarily an easy task to do, but I think it's well worth the effort. And I think there's a lot of promise in our movement disorder video analysis that could be tapped into this. The other area that needs to move forward, or we're proposing moves forward for theme 5, is to really look at how mixed tone interacts and impacts the response to treatments. So I've given an example here of in an individual who has both spasticity and dystonia, what is the impact or response to a selective dorsal rhizotomy? That's just one example, but how mixed tone patterns respond to interventions definitely is of interest. Next slide, on to theme 6.
All right, thanks, Darcy. And so theme 6 was the need to assess predictors of treatment response. And what this was trying to capture was that we really need better tools in order to be able to advise families with the sometimes difficult decisions that they are forced to make on behalf of their own or their child's best interest. And so the consolidated ideas that were incorporated here were, first of all, does the dystonia etiology or the cause or its severity itself play a role in the efficacy of the treatment, how well it works? Another question was, does earlier detection and intervention in dystonia actually lead to improved outcomes? And then finally, the idea of how does dystonia of varying severity affect recovery from surgical or medical interventions? All of these elements were thought to be important here. Next slide, please. And so in really thinking about this, there are some important principles that I think we know, although we don't know that these principles necessarily apply across the board. We do know that in some cases, earlier treatments improve outcomes, and I think that this is really a rallying cry around early diagnosis, early recognition, and early intervention. We do know that causes may be important, and that perhaps the reason why an individual has dystonia, and this will also factor into the next theme, may actually influence how he or she responds to treatment. And then finally, the idea that dystonia really is not the only factor that affects outcome, and that the person as a whole, including any other medical conditions, their ability to engage in purposeful movement, and their function are also important elements of how they're going to respond to a given treatment. So with this in mind, there are several things that we still need to determine. And that includes this idea of whether there are actually different types of dystonia. So should all dystonia be treated the same? I think is still an open question. Another question is, can patient variables or things like biomarkers, which includes genetic factors and others, or neuroimaging signatures, the things that we can find on advanced MRI, for example, can these things be used to actually predict response? And I think that this would be particularly useful, especially when families are trying to determine whether or not to go ahead with potentially invasive treatments. And then finally, along the lines that dystonia may not be dystonia across the board for everyone, that there may be individual differences, not only in the way that an individual's dystonia manifests, but also in how it responds to treatment. One thing that we would love to see further assessed would be this idea of personalized treatments for dystonia. And there are already some very intriguing examples of this currently. Next slide. So then on to theme 7, what causes dystonia in CP? This seems like a simple but important theme, and the consolidated ideas that contributed to this include what is the pathophysiologic mechanism for dystonia in CP? That is, what is really happening in the brain? Second idea was, is dystonia related to unorganized motor patterns driven by plasticity? So we know that the brain has this ability to learn and to change with time. And there is some evidence that in some ways dystonia actually represents a hijacking, if you will, of normal plasticity. And then finally, the last idea that went into this theme really was what percentage of patients with dystonic CP may have an underlying genetic cause for their symptoms. Next slide. So there are some important things that we do know. We do know, for example, that risk factors, we know several risk factors that contribute to dystonia in CP. And these can vary widely from genetic determinants to traumatic brain injuries to lack of oxygen to prematurity. But what's quite interesting is that there's not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence here, and there's not necessarily a direct path from a risk factor to dystonia. So for example, you might have two infants side by side who were both born early and both experienced some of the same challenges related to prematurity, but only one of them may develop CP, only one of them may develop dystonia, and the reasons why are not completely understood. If you go back to what we do know, we know that abnormalities of brain structure, that is brain wiring itself, as well as brain function, seem to be involved. But one piece that's been very elusive is really pinning down what are the essential elements that cause dystonia. And I think that if you challenged those of us who are on this webinar, despite the fact that we've dedicated our professional lives to understanding causes of dystonia in CP, we would be hard pressed to give you a firm answer as to exactly what is going on in the brain that causes dystonia. And going back to the analogy of the broken clock, it's hard to fix something when we don't understand very well how it works. So there was a sense that if we can understand what's going awry in the brain to lead to dystonia, that might help us to better develop targeted treatments to correct those missteps. Next slide.
So theme 8, what is the natural history of dystonia in CP? And this was a highly ranked theme based on a single highly voted idea. And we took almost that idea verbatim when we created the theme. Next slide, Paul. So one of the key things that we know about this theme is very little. And you may have recognized that. Oh, sorry, could you go back just one slide? Thank you. You may have recognized that all of these themes highlight various areas of lacks of knowledge that we have about dystonia and CP, but in particular, I feel that we don't know very much about how dystonia evolves in people with CP. Several people within the CPRN, including Michael and I, just published a paper talking about various things to consider in terms of natural history and evolution of symptoms in people with CP as they age. And though we had a lot to say about dystonia, very little of it was backed up with hard evidence. There is some sense that people with dystonia may be at higher risk of myelopathy, so of spinal cord compression, particularly if dystonia is in their neck later in life. So just because of wear and tear on your bones, just kind of the vertebral bones pushing on the spinal cord a little bit and causing neurologic problems. Whether that's a hard connection or not is unclear, but that's, I think, the most hard data we have about the natural history of dystonia and CP. So we need to find out a lot, and a lot of it involves longitudinal tracking of people with CP, which in and of itself is an initiative we all need to take up. I think we all know that the care, that medical care for people with CP tends to drop off as people transition from pediatric to adult providers. And engaging those adult providers and engaging people interested in tracking people with CP across the lifespan is going to be really critical to answering this theme. And we're hopeful that with the support of the community and initiatives like this one through the CPRN, that this can happen in the near future. Yes, forward, I think you're going back.
Great, so we're on to theme 9 now. And again, I was really pleased to see that this theme percolated forward as a priority. So it reflected one idea: what are the best treatments for pain secondary to dystonia? If you go to the next slide, Paul. So what's great to see about this is that there's recognition that dystonia and CP is associated with a high prevalence of pain. And we are discovering that in our clinical research. So in the second bullet there, in terms of what we know, we've identified as the second most common cause of moderate to severe pain in children with cerebral palsy. And the other thing that we're starting to recognize is that when you have a chronic pain syndrome, it sets the brain up for a bit of a negative cycle that actually heightens the perception of pain. And so that pain can continue to cycle and increase. So we're starting to garner some understanding of dystonia being associated with pain, that it's highly prevalent, that it can cause moderate to severe pain, and that if we have chronic pain, it can actually create a negative cycle. There's many, many things that we need to find out, and I've just highlighted a few here in the bullets. So we definitely need more evidence and information on what medications are the best at managing pain. I've used a lot of acronyms in the second bullet, so but we're really interested in looking at the impact of pain of different treatments like deep brain stimulation. ITB reflects intrathecal baclofen, BTA is botulinum toxin, CBD is medical marijuana, and CBT is something that I find really interesting, is looking at cognitive behavioral therapy approaches for pain management. The other thing that we really need to make sure is that we're including pain as an outcome in all of our clinical our research in dystonia and CP. Next slide to our final theme.
Okay, I'm excited to round out the top 10 with this critical theme: increased family awareness of dystonia and CP. This emerged from this idea and also from an earlier idea that we lumped in with increasing the clinical consistency of CP or of a dystonia diagnosis in CP. What education can we provide to physicians and families to improve awareness and diagnosis of dystonia? Next slide, please. So what we do know is that there is a delay in diagnosis of dystonia and CP, often of at least a few years, sometimes up to several years. And what we know, at least anecdotally, is in the families that have experienced this delay in diagnosis, that they may not be aware that the type of movement issues the person in their life with CP is having is actually dystonia until someone mentions the word and diagnoses it. So what we need to find out is, for one, do efforts like this help? And we really hope so. So by engaging the community, by talking to you about these results, by the webinars we did now almost a year ago, we're hoping that we're helping get the word out to increase community awareness of dystonia and CP. And this was mentioned in an earlier idea that we grouped in with the previous theme about increasing the clinical consistency of dystonia diagnosis in CP. There was an idea that specifically mentioned, would it be valuable to have a dystonia and CP toolkit akin to the CP toolkit that Michelle Schusterman on this call was instrumental in developing. And that would be a great idea, and feedback on that and suggestions for that would definitely be welcome. Obviously, increasing family awareness and the awareness of people with CP about dystonia is a critical step in self-advocacy and can help bridge the gap that we're trying to close by getting clinicians to be as focused on it as we are. So that's our top 10.
Great. Well, thank you, all of you so much. I apologize for, I was having some mouse difficulties that kept me going backwards instead of forward. So I apologize. So what I'd like to do now is, well, let me just clarify that where we go from here is we have whatever sort of discussion and feedback. You know, the ideas are the ideas. They're the top ranked ideas. They've just been, you know, organized into themes, and we will publish both the individual ideas as well as the themes as part of a manuscript that we're all working on, and we, you know, hope to get that to an appropriate journal in the coming months. So we're working hard on that, and there's a number of people working on it. There's a physician who works with Dr. Buma named Laura Gilbert, who's working on that, and Jonathan Mink has been very involved from the beginning of this process. So that's where we're going. What we want now is your comments and feedback. Do you think that the themes characterize, you know, the ideas well? Is there anything that you thought was missing? Any feedback? What I'll say is people can either do a chat, or they can just unmute and start to ask a question. And if I've got multiple people, I'll ask one person to stop and the other to go. So let me open the floor to questions. Crickets. Maybe people can hear my teenage daughter showering with music in the background, so maybe it's not crickets.
I can wade in and start the discussion. So
okay.
I was really delighted to see the importance of the 10 themes that were identified and voted on by the community and how well they hung together. There's some overlap in some of the themes, which I think is actually helpful because it will help to drive some forward movement. So overall, I actually felt the ideas that were generated were fulsome and really would help to move the field forward.
You got a second from Michelle Schusterman. Yeah, I think that this really started. I want to just relay the comment that Michael Kruer said to me, can we do one of these for dystonia? Because I really only want to work, like there's only so much I can do, and I only want to work on something that's really important to the community. And that was kind of the genesis of this, along with you know, a number of our community advisors saying they really wanted to see us do more work in here. So those two sort of thoughts came together and resulted in this. Connie, I see you're confirming that this is a positive. Anybody have any sort of other questions or discussion items for the group? Just because we're all assembled, I'm going to be patient and see if anyone's just working up their courage or their question. I'm gonna give a shout out to Wendy Kwan, who is on the webinar and is a volunteer to the organization and did all those nice spreadsheets that I had that really helped us dive in and sort of figure out. It was very hard to sort of figure out as we consolidated things which people that participated contributed to the top ideas, and she's a whiz with Excel and a pivot table, and really helped us get the learning out of that information. So thank you, Wendy. Okay, I see Kim, thank you so much for your time from New Zealand. We have to leave. Yeah, well, don't even know what time it is there, but I'm glad you were able to attend. Okay, well, I appreciate the positive comments. I really appreciate all the work that went into this from the three of you, Booma, Michael, and Darcy, that are lined up on my gallery here. I think it's been a great collaboration with Michelle and Melanie and with Jonathan Mink, and I greatly appreciate what Laura Gilbert's doing, and Wendy. It's really a great sort of volunteer effort that I think will result in something that gives people some direction. And I think there's things that I think you can expect that CPRN is doing some of these things with our quality improvement efforts that the three of you are involved in, with sort of changing the rate of diagnosis and sort of thinking these through, following people long-term. I think there's lots in here that is sort of gold for the CP Research Network to pursue. So greatly appreciate all of your time and commitment to this. I will post the webinar so all the people that couldn't make it from a timing perspective can sort of see the fruits of all your labor. And thank you guys so much for your time and effort, your commitment to helping this community.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all very much.
Our pleasure. Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.